The cold greets you first. A cold so old, so patient, that it feels less like weather and more like a judgment. You hear it before you feel it, a faint ringing tucked somewhere behind the wind, as if metal is singing far away in the dark. This is the Eastern Front. Not the battles, not the maps, not the history books, but the human edge of it, where men carried rifles, hunger, frostbite, orders they did not understand, and a silence that stretched out longer than the horizon itself. Before you drift off, take a soft moment to subscribe. It helps the stories find their way back through the quiet. Let your breathing settle, let the wind fade, and step with me into the snow. You're listening to Echoes of War. The German soldiers who marched east didn't know what waited for them. Some expected a short campaign. Some believed in promises. Some just followed orders because that was the world they had inherited. And some, quietly, privately, already doubted everything. But once they arrived, the land swallowed their expectations whole. Forests so thick they felt endless. Villages burned down to chimney spines. Fields of white so wide you could walk all day and never find the end. And in all of it, an enemy that seemed to rise out of the snow itself. Here, ideology meant little. Cold meant everything. You can almost feel their breath freezing inside their scarves. You can hear the crunch of boots stiff with ice. You sense how time loses its shape out here, days turning into a long grey ache. Most of all, you feel the weight of isolation. Not just physical, but moral. A growing awareness inside many of them that the war they were fighting was not the war they had been told. And so tonight, as you drift into the quiet, we walk beside them, not to glorify, not to excuse, but to understand. To linger with the cold, the doubt, the frostbitten hands gripping a Mauser rifle, the letters home that never sounded quite honest, and the whispered fear that none of them dared speak aloud. Will I ever see home again? The road east. The road east did not begin with snow. It began with dust, long columns stretching across summer fields, engines coughing warm air, boots raising thin yellow clouds that clung to the hems of uniforms. The men marched beneath a sun that felt almost forgiving, a sun that made the whole war seem strangely possible. For many German soldiers, this was the moment they remembered with a tight, uneasy nostalgia. Before the frost, before the hunger, before the silence. They had been told the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, that the enemy would crumble, that they were marching toward a victory already half-written. Some believed it, some didn't. But all of them kept moving. Landscapes rolled by, villages built from pale timber, birch forests shimmering in the wind, wheat fields swaying in soft gold. At night they slept in barns, in meadows, under trucks, sometimes under the stars. Letters home were optimistic then, full of the casual confidence of men who had not yet felt winter's teeth. They marched past children standing barefoot at the edges of roads, watching silently, past families who did not wave, past the first signs that this land was not like the others they had crossed. The roads grew longer, the distances wider. Maps felt strangely inaccurate, never capturing the true vastness of the place. And deep within the column, men began to sense something they did not speak aloud. They were entering a world designed to swallow armies. Still, spirits held. The summer air made everything feel possible. Trucks rattled forward. Boots struck earth in rhythm. Officers barked orders that still sounded crisp and sharp. War had not yet revealed its real shape. But in small corners of their minds, some soldiers felt the faintest prickle of doubt, a quiet sense of marching toward something far larger than they had imagined. Something waiting. Something cold. The first shift in the wind. The first shift came quietly. not through gunfire or ambush or any dramatic moment soldiers later wrote about, but through the weather. A subtle coolness slipped into the evenings. Breath lingered longer at dawn. The fields no longer shimmered with summer heat. Officers spoke confidently. Radios carried messages full of certainty, but the men felt the change before anyone admitted it. The road grew harsher. Rain turned dust into thick mud. Trucks stalled in ruts, and entire companies pushed their shoulders into steel just to move a vehicle another few meters. Boots stayed wet for days, socks never dried, and the first cases of foot rot appeared quietly, unmentioned. Still, they walked. Distances stretched wider. A village marked on a map took 2 days to reach. A supply depot promised by command was simply not there. A river that looked narrow on paper turned out to be a cold, churning barrier that split the land in two. At night, soldiers listened to the wind brushing through the trees. It carried strange sounds, distant engines, cracking branches, and something else, a sense of movement just beyond sight. It was the first hint of the Red Army's presence, watching from the forests, shifting through the undergrowth. But the soldiers did not speak of it yet. They spoke instead of home, meals waiting for them, girls they planned to marry, victories they assumed still lay ahead. These conversations became a lantern in the dark. Yet underneath, something was changing. A growing awareness that they were marching deeper into a land that did not feel conquered, a land that slowed them, tired them, resisted without lifting a weapon. And as they pushed forward, they sensed, faintly but unmistakably, that this campaign, this war, this march into the East would not end the way they had been promised. Something was waiting for them out there. Something colder than the wind. Something older than the war. But for now, they kept marching. The land that fights back. Before the first true battle, the soldiers encountered an enemy they had not been trained to defeat, the land itself. The Eastern Front was not just a direction, it was an entirely different world, a world where distances expanded like breath turning to fog, where forests swallowed sound, and where the sky hung heavier than anywhere they had known. The first villages they occupied did not offer cheering crowds or flowers or scenes of triumph. They greeted the soldiers with silence. Homes built from rough logs, yards empty except for a few wandering chickens, wells covered with wooden lids worn smooth by generations, all of it watched by people who kept their distance behind curtains. The silence felt like a warning. Every day pushed them deeper into a landscape that grew stranger. Open plains made them feel exposed. Rivers twisted unpredictably. Forest belts tightened around the roads like dark corridors leading nowhere. And everywhere, the same feeling followed them, as if the land itself was studying them. Officers insisted morale remain high, speaking confidently of encirclement tactics and rapid advances. But soldiers saw crates arriving half empty, horses dying along the roadside, fuel drums lighter than expected, uniforms fraying from constant wear. The campaign was meant to be fast, yet the land stretched every hour into something long and grinding. Slowly, quietly, a new question crept into their minds, not spoken aloud, but present in every trudging step. How far does this place go? The horizon never changed. The villages blurred together. The forests breathed with a kind of patience that felt ancient. And deep within the trees, unseen but always present, the Red Army waited, not broken, not fleeing, but watching. The soldiers began to understand that this was no ordinary war. This was an entire world pushing back. The forest that sees everything. As they pushed deeper east, the forests became something entirely different from the woods they had grown up near. These trees were older, darker, crowded so tightly that the sky was reduced to a pale ribbon overhead. Even in daylight, the undergrowth carried a kind of dusk. Every sound felt wrong, absorbed too quickly, swallowed before it could echo. The soldiers felt watched. They didn't speak it aloud, not at first, but the feeling spread through the ranks like a shared dream. A twig snapped too sharply. A flash of movement slid between trunks. A metallic glint flickered and vanished. Birds quieted without warning. The forest didn't just surround them, it observed them. At first, men blamed their nerves. They told themselves exhaustion could play tricks on the senses. But soon, the illusions broke. The Red Army was not shattered. The Soviet retreat was deliberate, controlled, and the forests were full of them. Scouts moved between trees like shadows. Marksmen lay hidden beneath branches, patient as stone. Small Soviet teams tracked every German road, every column, every position. A soldier would swear he saw a face watching from the trees, but by the time he blinked, the shape was gone. Some nights brought sudden violence. A single shot from nowhere, a guard silently falling, rifles trembling in numb hands as men searched for an enemy they couldn't see. Other nights brought nothing at all, and that emptiness was somehow worse. Silence meant safety, or a trap inches away. Uncertainty gnawed at them. It stole sleep. It shortened tempers. It made even veterans jump at the crack of their own boots. War on the Eastern Front was fought not just with bullets, but with patience, fear, and waiting that stretched into hours so tense that even breathing felt like a risk. A few soldiers rubbed small crosses or icons hidden in their pockets. Others stared into the darkness until their eyes stung. Eventually, exhaustion forced their eyes closed, but sleep remained shallow, fragile, and inside every dreaming mind rose the same helpless thought. If they come, I won't hear them until it's too late. The forest knew this. The Soviets knew this. And by morning, the soldiers understood with absolute clarity. They were no longer the hunters. In these woods, they were the ones being tracked. First contact. The first real clash didn't begin with shouting or a charge or anything dramatic. It began with a single, distant crack, so soft at first that many soldiers thought it was just a branch snapping under snow. But the officers froze. The veterans froze. And a cold understanding spread instantly down the line. That wasn't wood. That was a rifle. The shot came from the tree-line, quiet, precise, measured. A corporal fell forward without a sound. No warning, no cry, just a sudden collapse into the mud. Then the forest answered. Not with a volley, not with chaos, but with movement. Shadows slipping between trunks, leaves trembling despite the still air, the metallic click of a bolt being readied somewhere unseen. The soldiers dropped to the ground, fingers stiff with cold as they scrambled for their rifles. Eyes scanned the tree-line, searching desperately for shapes that refused to appear. The Red Army was no longer a rumor behind the horizon. They were right there, calm, hidden, patient. More shots followed, spaced out, deliberate. Each one forced the men lower, pressing their chests into the frozen earth. Each one reminded them that the enemy had chosen the place, the distance, the timing. This was not blitzkrieg rolling across open plains. This was something slower, older, woven into the land itself. When German machine guns finally roared in response, the forest swallowed the noise. It absorbed the gunfire, threw back scattered echoes, revealed nothing of where the shooters were. No targets appeared. No figures broke from cover. Only the sense of being observed by men who knew these woods better than the soldiers knew their own uniforms. When the firing finally subsided, the soldiers lifted their heads cautiously. They expected a charge, a rush, a counterattack. Instead, nothing. Only the vast, heavy quiet of a world that had decided to wait and watch. For many of them, That first day of contact carried a lesson they felt more than understood. The enemy you cannot see. Night fell quickly on the Eastern Front. Not like in Europe, where dusk softened the sky into colors. Here, darkness dropped all at once, like a curtain falling, and with the darkness came a fear the soldiers struggled to name. The forest changed at night. It stopped being scenery and became a presence. Every branch creaked like a boot step. Every gust of wind felt like someone's breath on the back of the neck. Every distant rustle sounded like a figure shifting weight, preparing to fire. They built a perimeter, posted guards, whispered orders. But the truth settled among them like frost. They had no idea where the enemy was. Somewhere out there, 30 meters away or 300, Soviet scouts lay in silence, watching through rifle sights. Men trained to melt into the darkness. Men who could wait longer than exhaustion allowed a German soldier to stay alert. Sometimes a man swore he saw a figure between the trees, a flicker of a silhouette, but when he blinked, the shape was gone. Some nights brought sudden violence. A single shot. A guard falling quietly. A ripple of movement. Officers whispering for everyone to stay low as rifles trembled in hands that could barely feel the trigger. Other nights brought nothing at all, and that was far worse. Silence could mean safety, or scouts crawling closer, inch by inch. Uncertainty hollowed them. It shortened breaths, sharpened nerves, stole sleep. Even veterans admitted, quietly, that they had never felt anything like this. War here wasn't just fought with bullets. It was fought with waiting, with listening, with a fear that stretched into hours, thin as wire and just as ready to snap. Some soldiers prayed quietly, rubbing small charms hidden in their pockets. Others stared into the darkness until their eyes burned. Eventually, exhaustion forced them into a fragile half-sleep that broke at every imagined sound. And under that half-sleep, every man carried the same truth. If the Soviets came in the night, they would not hear them until it was already over. In these woods, the night itself was an enemy. The cold arrives. The cold didn't arrive with storms or drama. It arrived quietly, the same way everything on the Eastern Front crept into a man's life. One morning, soldiers woke to see their breath hanging in the air a little longer. Their blankets felt thinner. The ground beneath them felt harder, as if the earth itself had frozen during the night. Even the metal handles of their mess tins burned their fingers with cold instead of heat. And then, day by day, the temperature kept dropping. Jokes slowed. Conversations shortened. Hands that once moved easily over rifle bolts stiffened until even basic tasks felt clumsy. Officers insisted winter clothing would arrive soon. Supply trains were imminent. Wool coats, gloves, felt boots, all promised. But the soldiers sensed the truth well before anyone said it aloud. Winter had outrun the logistics. They had only summer coats. Leather boots meant for autumn mud. Scrap fabrics tied around hands in place of gloves. Meanwhile, the cold swallowed everything. Rivers froze with sounds like groaning steel. Horses exhaled steam like tired engines. Mud cooled into brittle, uneven ridges that shattered under marching feet. Inside their foxholes, frost crept along the walls in delicate crystalline patterns that looked almost beautiful until they melted from breath and soaked their clothes, turning cold again a few hours later. Some men rubbed their hands until the skin cracked. Others wrapped rags around their feet that froze stiff by morning. A few felt numbness spreading through their toes, the kind that never fully returned. Still, orders pushed them forward. The war didn't pause for weather, and the cold didn't pause for the war. Something fundamental shifted inside the men in those days. They stopped fearing the Soviets the most. They started fearing the temperature. On the Eastern Front, winter didn't simply accompany the enemy. It fought for the enemy. When the cold takes the body. On the Eastern Front, cold wasn't weather. It was a slow possession, patient, methodical, almost intelligent in the way it dismantled a human being. First it took feeling. Fingers lost their sensitivity. A man could touch his rifle and barely sense the steel under his skin. He'd try to button his coat and fumble like a child learning the motion for the first time. Then it took color. Ears turned pale. Noses lost warmth despite constant rubbing. Cheeks faded into a sickly gray that made even the young look old. Next, the cold took sleep. No amount of fabric, no closeness to others, no shared body heat could hold it off. Men woke every few minutes in shallow, jittering half-rests, always aware of the temperature pressing inward like a slow tightening fist. And then came numbness, the stage every man feared. It wasn't a useful numbness. It was dangerous. A seductive quietness told the body it wasn't so bad, that the cold felt almost peaceful, that maybe a man could loosen his coat or close his eyes for a moment. Medics knew what that meant. Once the cold reached the bones, it didn't give them back. A hand placed too long on metal froze to it. A rifle pressed against a cheek during aiming ripped skin when lowered. Fabrics stiffened into shapes that no longer bent. Some men walked on feet they could not feel, hearing only the crunch of snow, not knowing if the skin beneath was splitting. Medics worked constantly, but couldn't keep up. Cold moved faster than bandages, faster than warmth could return, faster than orders could change. Around them, the world froze too, trees cracking open like bones under strain, rivers locking solid, air so sharp it stung the throat. The cold slowed every step, every thought, until the men felt as though they were moving underwater. Even their memories seemed to drift, weighed down by exhaustion. Some began to hallucinate in the silence. Shapes in the snow, voices in the wind, the crackle of ice sounding like someone calling their name. Day by day, winter eroded them. Not suddenly, slowly, quietly, completely. The Eastern Front didn't break bodies in dramatic moments. It wore them away, layer by frozen layer. Letters home. When the front finally slowed under the pressure of winter, the soldiers found themselves doing something unexpected. They began to write. Not because they had time, and certainly not because they were warm. They wrote because the silence between battles had grown so heavy that words felt like the only shelter left. They crouched inside dugouts lit by weak candles, their breath turning to frost in the air. Ink froze if left uncovered too long, and paper softened from the constant damp. Some wrote with pencils because they were the only tools that still functioned. They wrote in stiff, cramped handwriting, hands trembling from cold, telling stories meant to travel hundreds of kilometers to kitchens and living rooms far from this frozen line. The letters they sent home were always bright on the surface. "We're holding firm. The Russians are retreating. The cold is bad, but we manage." These were the lines families needed to hear, fragments of hope wrapped in careful optimism. But the letters they never sent, the ones folded and hidden or burned after rereading, told a different truth. They spoke of frost that gnawed through boots, of nights spent listening for footsteps in the dark, of fear that settled into their chests like a second heartbeat. Some wrote about hunger, others about doubts they weren't supposed to have. A few wrote lines so heavy with guilt or clarity that they destroyed them immediately, terrified of what could happen if those words were found. Occasionally a soldier shared a letter he had received, a warm detail from home, a story about snow falling in Bavaria or bread rising in an oven, a picture from a sister or a kiss pressed into a sheet of paper. For a few minutes, the dugout softened. The cold seemed to step back. Men listened with tired eyes, their thoughts drifting toward a world that now felt impossibly far. But when the reading ended, silence reclaimed everything. The war outside waited like an unfinished sentence, and every man understood that each letter home was a conversation with a life slipping further away. The farther east they marched, the harder it became to imagine those kitchens, those warm rooms, those people who waited for news. For many soldiers, writing became a ritual not of hope, but of remembrance, a way to hold on. When hope turns thin. Even the strongest men carried a small flame inside them, a quiet, unspoken hope that helped them endure the endless cold. For some, it was the promise of returning home. For others, it was the dream of surviving the winter. And for a few, it was simply the thought of making it through the next night. But as the days dragged on, that flame began to flicker. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the way a candle shrinks unnoticed until it's almost gone. Food rations arrived late, then smaller, then sometimes not at all. Bread froze into bricks so hard they had to be thawed under an armpit before they could be bitten. Canned meat became a luxury spoken about the way city people speak about treasures, as if it belonged to another world entirely. Men shared more quietly now, a crust passed hand to hand, a spoonful divided between 3 men. These gestures carried a weight far heavier than the food itself, and in that slow erosion of comfort, something deeper eroded with it: belief. The first crack was small, a private thought. This isn't the quick victory we were promised. A glance exchanged when officers repeated slogans no one quite believed anymore. A creeping suspicion that headquarters had no idea what the front truly looked like. Then the crack widened. Rumors spread. Trains stuck behind the lines, Soviet reinforcements arriving from the east, entire German units disappearing in the forests. Some soldiers accused the land of swallowing them. Others whispered that the Red Army was not collapsing, but coiling, preparing to strike back harder. But the most dangerous erosion wasn't tactical. It was emotional. Men who once spoke of victories now spoke only of survival. Men who once joked stared blankly into the evening fires. Men who once marched with purpose now shivered and drifted, thinking only of warmth. The flame that kept them moving didn't go out at once. It thinned. It dimmed. It became a fragile ember inside a world made of ice. By winter's deepest nights, many soldiers felt the same truth settling into their bones. On the Eastern Front, hope itself was a ration, and it was running low. The slow starvation. Hunger arrived quietly at first, an emptiness after meals, a hollow feeling that could be ignored. But as supplies thinned and the cold consumed calories faster than the men could replenish them, hunger sharpened into something far more demanding. It became a companion that followed them through every march, every watch, every sleepless night. It changed the way the soldiers moved and thought. A man might check the same pocket twice, knowing it was empty but hoping for a forgotten crumb. Another might lick the corners of his ration tin to catch whatever taste remained. Conversations drifted whenever food was mentioned. Eyes narrowed whenever someone opened a package, no matter how small. Some scavenged frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, chipping them out of ice with bayonets. Others boiled strips of leather from old harnesses into bitter, oily soup. Bread hardened into bricks, and men held it under their arms to warm it before biting. Canned meat, when it appeared, was treated with a reverence normally reserved for treasure. Officers spoke in hopeful tones about supply delays, trains trapped behind the lines, depots just one push away. But the soldiers saw the truth in the faces of the quartermasters. There was simply not enough. Not for the men. Not for the horses. Not for the front. And hunger wasn't just physical. It changed the rhythm of the mind. It fueled fear, sharpened despair, stole the last reserves of strength. Men became quiet, withdrawn, protective of what little they had. Some tried to save a scrap of bread for later, only to wake and find they had eaten it in their sleep. At night, the soldiers lay still, hands folded over their stomachs, listening to the wind scraping across the snow. The cold hollowed their bodies. The hunger hollowed everything else. Sometimes a man whispered in the dark, "If the Russians don't kill us, the winter will," and no one argued. No one had the energy to. On the Eastern Front, hunger wasn't just a feeling. It was a weapon, slow, relentless, and devastating. When the body begins to break. As hunger deepened and winter hardened, the soldiers began to learn that the body gives warnings before it gives up. First came the trembling. Not from fear, this was different, but from something deep inside, a constant vibration in their arms and legs that never fully stopped. Men tried to hide it, tucking their hands under their coats, clenching their jaws, but the tremors always returned. Then came weakness. Boots felt heavier. Rifles felt heavier. Even lifting a mess tin required effort. Some men stumbled during marches, catching themselves on trees or on the shoulders of their comrades. Others needed two hands to steady a weapon they once handled with ease. Their muscles weren't sore, they were empty, and then the mind began to thin. Not dramatically, not with confusion or hallucination at first, but with a drifting fog. Men repeated sentences without realizing it. They misheard simple orders. They stared at maps as though they were written in a foreign language. A soldier might be called by name twice before he turned his head. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was starvation reshaping thought. The medics recognized the signs. They wrapped frostbitten limbs, tried to feed the weakest, whispered quiet encouragement to keep a man awake. But they also knew the truth. The body dissolves faster in the cold, and winter moves faster than any medical supplies could reach the front. Some men drank melted snow despite knowing it could make them sick. The need for water was more urgent than the risk. Others rationed the last crumbs in their pockets, only to panic when they reached for them later and found they had already eaten them. A few muttered prayers under their breath, though no one admitted it. At night, sleep brought no relief. Legs cramped. Joints stiffened. Dreams blurred into images of food that vanished whenever touched. Some soldiers began to see shapes in the dark, shadows that moved, voices that whispered through the wind. The line between exhaustion and illusion grew thinner by the hour. Every day, winter stripped another layer from them. Body, mind, memory. Not abruptly, but as erosion, the quiet wearing down of men who had once marched proudly under a summer sun. On the Eastern Front, survival was not a single battle. It was resisting a slow collapse from the inside out. The endless retreat. Retreat on the Eastern Front didn't begin with a shouted order or a dramatic collapse. It began the way so many things did out there, quietly. A rumor passed between sentries. A map folded too quickly. A supply convoy that didn't appear. Then one morning, the truth arrived disguised as an instruction. Pull back, hold a new line. But the soldiers heard the real meaning beneath it. They could no longer stay. The retreat didn't feel like movement at first. It felt like exhaustion changing direction. Men who had marched east with long, confident strides now trudged west with short, uneven steps. Their coats were thinner, their packs lighter, their faces hollow from cold and hunger. The land they crossed looked different now. Fields were frozen into ridged plates of earth. Villages they had passed in summer were nothing but burned chimneys rising from snow. Forests that once watched them quietly now felt like they were closing in. There was no rhythm to the withdrawal. Sometimes the men walked in heavy silence. Sometimes artillery boomed behind them, a constant reminder that the Soviets were no longer waiting. Sometimes a soldier collapsed in the snow and had to be dragged upright by those beside him. And sometimes, despite every effort, he simply didn't rise at all. No one used the word defeat. Officers spoke of shortening the line or redeploying. The radios insisted it was temporary. But the men felt the truth pressing in with every step. They were returning the way they had come, not as conquerors, but as men being pushed home by an enemy they no longer understood. Every step west felt heavier, every kilometer longer. Every night brought the same dread. Would the Red Army catch them before morning? They could feel it in the air, in the ground, in their bones. The Soviets weren't scattered anymore. They were organized, confident, advancing. One soldier murmured to a comrade, hardly louder than the wind, "We marched into the snow. Now the snow is marching after us." No one corrected him. The retreat wasn't simply a change of direction. It was the war revealing its true shape, a long unwinding, a reckoning, a journey through a land that had never wanted them and now refused to let them leave easily. When the enemy turns into a tide. As the retreat deepened, the soldiers sensed something that chilled them more than the winter air. The Red Army wasn't just following them. It was swelling, gathering strength with every passing day. The horizon shifted constantly. The ground trembled faintly with distant artillery. Machine gun fire rolled like thunder from directions that shouldn't have been reachable so quickly. What had once been scattered ambushes now felt like a tide pushing relentlessly west. The enemy grew larger in whispers before they ever appeared in sight. Rumors spread through the ragged columns. Fresh Siberian divisions arriving with winter in their bones, tanks that moved easily through deep snow, artillery units firing with uncanny precision, and Soviet forces forming lines so long they seemed to stretch from one edge of the sky to the other. The soldiers felt the truth in small details. Shells landing closer than before, patrols disappearing without explanation, Soviet scouts seen at distances that should have been safe. Each new day tightened the pressure. The retreat wasn't a withdrawal anymore. It was a narrowing corridor. One evening, as the men stumbled into the ruins of a village to rest, the sky flashed with distant fire. The air vibrated with a kind of momentum the Germans hadn't felt in months. Someone whispered, "They're not chasing us. They're sweeping us." The word lingered in the cold. Sweeping. It felt right. The Soviets were no longer reacting to German movements. They were shaping them. The retreat became a scramble to stay ahead of something vast, coordinated, unending. The soldiers looked at each other with a new understanding. Not panic, not despair, but a quiet realization that they had become part of something much larger than their own orders or maps. They weren't fighting a series of battles anymore. They were being carried by a tide they couldn't stop and could barely outrun. For the first time, they saw themselves not as soldiers holding a line, but as men caught in the wake of an army rising behind them. An army that had endured its own suffering and was now moving forward with the force of inevitability. The encirclement begins. The encirclement did not arrive with sudden violence. It arrived like a change in the air, subtle, invisible, but unmistakable. Scouts returned with tension in their eyes. Maps were pulled closer to lanterns. Officers spoke in shorter sentences. No one needed to say the word Kessel yet. The men felt it forming around them. The first sign came when a supply route went silent. A road that had been safe the week before suddenly offered nothing but the tracks of abandoned wagons half buried in snow. Another path west showed signs of recent fighting. Shattered crates, spent shell casings, a frozen horse lying stiff in its harness. The soldiers looked at the wreckage and understood. The lines behind them were thinning. The space to retreat was shrinking. Radio signals grew erratic. Some came through distorted. Others, not at all. Directions meant for one unit arrived hours late to another. The men marched from position to position without knowing whether they were falling back or simply circling a drain. Snow drifted thicker. Winds shifted. The world around them felt tight, as if the horizon itself had begun to close. Then came the Soviet pressure. Not overwhelming at first. Just a steady push. A patrol cut off here. A defensive line overrun there. Artillery that landed closer each day. At night, the sky glowed faintly with distant fire, and the earth vibrated in long, low pulses that carried through the soles of their boots. The men whispered among themselves, not about tactics or hope, but about the strange sense that they were being guided, herded, moved toward a point they couldn't see. Every hill felt like it hid an ambush. Every forest felt like it held watchers. Every clearing felt too large, too exposed. By the time the officers confirmed what everyone already knew, that Soviet forces were pushing around their flanks, the soldiers felt a kind of quiet acceptance settle in. They had been here before in training, in theory. But not like this. Not in winter. Not hungry, exhausted, half-frozen, and marching into a shape on the map that felt less like a tactical situation and more like a jaw closing. Encirclement had begun. When escape turns into delay. Once the threat became official, everything accelerated. Orders came rapidly, sometimes contradicting each other. One unit was told to hold a ridge. Another was told to abandon it. Some were instructed to break south, others north. The men followed as best they could, trudging through snow that rose to their shins, breath burning in their throats. Rifles carried more for obligation than for hope. Every direction felt wrong. When they pushed west, they found Soviet patrols. When they moved east, they collided with retreating German units. When they shifted north or south, they encountered stretches of forest so dense that even daylight struggled to enter. The soldiers realized they were not maneuvering out of danger. They were circling it. The cold worsened. Hunger deepened. Men who had once marched in columns now drifted along in loose, ragged groups, stopping only to catch their breath or shake warmth back into their limbs. Communication broke down further. Runners didn't return. Messenger vehicles froze in place. Even compasses seemed to fail in the numbing cold. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said relief divisions were on their way. Others insisted the Soviets had already sealed the pocket. A few whispered that escape was still possible, a narrow corridor through the woods that might let a fraction of them through. No one knew for sure. And then there were the sounds at night. Distant engines. Wolves howling. Artillery rumbling like thunder rolling across the plains. Men lay awake in their shallow shelters, gripping rifles with numb fingers, waiting for an attack that sometimes arrived and sometimes didn't. The pressure didn't break them quickly. It squeezed them slowly. One soldier muttered into his scarf, "We're not moving. We're being moved." The others didn't answer. They felt it too. The Soviets weren't charging at them with overwhelming force. They were shaping the battlefield, narrowing every option, pushing the Germans into a space that shrank with each passing hour. By the time the men saw how small their world had become, they were already inside it, and the ring continued to tighten. When the ring closes. Dawn arrived without color. It didn't brighten the horizon. It only thinned the darkness enough to show the silhouettes of trees and the faint gleam of frost clinging to every branch. The soldiers rose stiffly from sleep, or something like sleep, a shallow, shivering half-rest that left them more exhausted than before. Their rifles felt heavier. Their coats felt thinner. Their breaths rose in pale, uncertain wisps. It was in that dim half-light that they sensed it. Something in the air had changed. The silence felt crowded. The forest seemed to listen. Even the wind moved with a kind of purpose. Then they heard the sound, faint at first, carried through the trees like a distant drumbeat. Boots on snow. Many of them. Slow. Steady. Advancing. The Soviets were closing the ring. A ripple moved through the German line. Not panic, but a quiet, bracing tension. Men tightened their scarves, checked their bolts, adjusted their belts. Officers spoke in tight murmurs, drawing quick arrows in the snow with gloved fingers, their breath mixing with the cold air in thin clouds. No one raised their voice. No one wasted a word. They all knew what was happening. The encirclement wasn't a possibility anymore. It was here. To the east, dark shapes flickered between the trees, infantry moving with disciplined intent. To the north, bursts of machine-gun fire crackled briefly and then died away. To the south, the air vibrated with the dull, distant growl of tanks. And to the west, the direction the men needed most, the land lay open but not free. Scouts returned with tight faces, whispering the truth. The Soviets were there as well. It was a trap with no weak side. Some soldiers reached for small talismans tucked under their coats. A pendant, a wooden cross, a folded letter worn soft from rereading. Not because they believed it would change anything, but because it reminded them they had names, memories, lives. Things the cold had not taken yet. A voice near the rear murmured, "If we break through, we live." Another answered softly, "If we don't, we stay here forever." But the tone wasn't panicked. It was resigned, almost calm, the steady acceptance of men who understood that the next few hours would define the rest of their lives. As the first Soviet shells began to fall, heavy and muffled in the snow, the men felt the world tighten around them. They lowered their heads, steadied their grips, and braced for what was coming. The ring had closed. When the circle becomes a cage. The order to prepare came in a whisper passed from officer to officer, moving down the frozen line like a final prayer. The men rose from the snow, joints aching, limbs stiff with cold. They could barely feel their fingers. Some couldn't feel their toes at all. But they moved, not with strength, but with the last threads of instinct. The only direction left was west. They couldn't see the Soviets yet, but they felt them. Every breath seemed to carry that knowledge. The sense of being watched from the trees. The sense of weapons being raised. The sense that the forest itself was holding its breath. A flare hissed upward and bathed the landscape in pale green light. Shadows stretched long across the snow. The moment the light faded, rifles clicked shut, bolts slid home, and the first German machine gun opened fire, not to kill, but to carve a heartbeat of confusion into the Soviet line. The men surged forward. There was no formation, no discipline, just movement, a desperate push through snow that clung to their legs and slowed every stride. Some stumbled. Some leapt fallen logs. Some clutched their rifles like lifelines. And behind them, the Soviets answered. Rifle fire cracked along the flank. Bullets snapped overhead, tearing through branches, kicking up bursts of snow that glittered briefly before settling back into silence. Mortars thudded behind them, throwing earth and ice into the air. The ground shook with each blast, and the shock waves knocked several men off their feet. Still they ran, not because they believed they could all escape, but because stopping meant dying where they stood. A shout rose from somewhere near the front. "There's a gap." Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. Hope, even fragile hope, had gravity. They pushed toward the opening, a narrow corridor where the snow was unbroken and shadows lay undisturbed. Bullets whistled past. The air vibrated with overlapping bursts of machine gun fire. But the gap held. A soldier at the flank whispered, "Just let me reach the light." Another stumbled beside him, breath tearing from his lungs. A third dragged a wounded comrade for several meters before the weight grew too heavy and instinct forced him onward alone. They were no longer breaking through a line. They were racing a noose as it tightened. And in the cold, grey dawn, the snowfield ahead opened like a held breath. The breakout attempt. The order came without fanfare, a low, strained whisper that passed from man to man until it reached the farthest edge of the line. Prepare to move. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Every soldier felt the urgency in the air, the tightening grip of the Soviet cordon, the sense that the window for escape was narrowing with every breath. They rose from the snow with stiff, painful movements. Some men needed help to stand. Others leaned heavily on their rifles, using the cold metal as a crutch. Their faces were hollow from hunger. Their coats were crusted with frost. Their breath formed thin clouds that dissolved quickly into the freezing morning. Then, without further delay, they stepped forward. The breakout began with a single burst of machine gun fire, a harsh, desperate burst meant not to strike a target, but to create a moment of confusion before the Soviets adjusted. The men surged toward the west, toward the only direction that offered even a sliver of possibility. The snow slowed them immediately. Every step broke through the crust into powder beneath, turning the sprint into a labored, staggering charge. Their boots slipped. Their legs burned. Their lungs seized from the cold air. But they ran anyway. And then the Soviets responded. Rifle fire cracked along the tree-line. Bullets snapped past ears, thudded into trees, and kicked up fountains of snow that drifted back down in slow, ghostly arcs. Mortar shells landed behind them with deep, muffled explosions that sent shock waves rolling across the ground. Men fell, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a choked cry that was lost in the roar of gunfire. Still, the line pushed forward. A soldier stumbled as a shell burst nearby, and another grabbed him under the arm, pulling him along until he found his footing again. A machine gun swept across the field, and the men veered instinctively, adjusting their path in the blind hope of slipping through the smallest gap. A sergeant shouted something, maybe an order, maybe a warning, but the wind carried his voice away before anyone could hear it. The world narrowed to snow, breath, and movement. Every man knew what this was. Not a charge, not an assault, but a gamble. If they could find a break in the Soviet line, if they could exploit it before the enemy adjusted, they might survive. If not, they would join the frozen shapes already lying behind them. And then, through the chaos, someone shouted from the front, "There, a gap!" It didn't matter if it was real. It was direction. It was hope. The soldiers barreled toward it with whatever strength remained in their bodies. Their vision blurred from exhaustion. Their legs trembled. Their hearts pounded so hard they could feel it in their fingertips. But the thought pulsed inside them, raw, simple, desperate. Move, move, move. Around them, the encirclement tightened. Ahead of them, the snowfield opened. The breakout had begun in earnest. When the line breaks, and men break with it. The so-called gap was not a path or a clearing. It wasn't even truly open. It was simply the thinnest point in a wall of fire, a brief hesitation in Soviet gunfire, a moment where the enemy shifted positions, just enough to give the illusion of escape. The first men reached it at a full sprint. Their boots plunged deep into the snow. Their breath tore from their lungs. Their hands clutched their rifles not as weapons, but as anchors to keep them upright. For a heartbeat, the opening felt real. Then the world erupted. A Soviet machine gun hidden behind a fallen tree unleashed a torrent of fire. Snow leapt upward in violent bursts. Men fell mid-stride, their bodies collapsing into the white in brutal, sudden silence. The line buckled. Several soldiers dove aside, others dropped flat, and a few simply froze, stunned by the shock and the impossibility of the path before them. A voice cried out, "Left flank! Left!" But the order dissolved into chaos as the machine gun shifted and found new targets. The retreating soldiers veered instinctively, scattering just enough to disrupt the kill line. But every step cost them. Mortars landed behind them with muffled, crushing force. Shrapnel hissed through the air. A man lost his footing and slid down a small embankment, scrambling back up as bullets snapped past him. Still they ran. One soldier reached down to help a fallen comrade, but when he lifted the man's arm and felt how limp it was, he hesitated. It lasted only a second, a single flicker of doubt, but in that second the truth revealed itself. He couldn't carry him. Not now. Not under this fire. Not at this speed. With a shaking breath, he let go and kept running. Ahead, the snowfield widened. The faint outline of a ridge appeared in the distance. Dark shapes at the top, impossible to identify at first, then gradually sharpening into the silhouettes of German soldiers holding the far line. The sight jolted the survivors with a burst of desperate energy. They pushed harder. A private stumbled to his knees, hands in the snow, eyes unfocused. He tried to stand, but the cold had hollowed him out. Another soldier dragged him a few steps before the weight became too much. The private looked up once, lips moving silently, and then his strength left him completely. The others kept moving. The ridge drew closer. German machine guns opened fire overhead, laying down covering fire to shield the last sprinting men. Tracers cut through the morning air. Snow kicked up in violent fountains. The soldiers felt the vibrations of explosions rolling through their legs as they climbed the final slope. And then, hands grabbed them. Arms pulled them upward. Voices urged them on. One by one, the survivors spilled onto the ridge, gasping, coughing, shaking uncontrollably. When they finally turned to look back across the snowfield, they saw the bodies of the fallen scattered behind them, slowly disappearing beneath drifting snow. The Soviets continued advancing, methodical and unhurried. The breakout had succeeded, but only in the sense that anyone remained to tell the story. On the Eastern Front, success and survival often looked the same. The snowfield of no return. The forest didn't end gently. It broke open all at once, revealing a wide snowfield stretching toward a distant ridge. The sudden openness felt like stepping into a dream, pale, silent, and strangely exposed. For a moment, the soldiers hesitated at the tree-line, staring at the expanse before them. It looked like freedom, but they all felt the truth in their bones. Open ground meant death. Behind them, the Soviets pressed closer. Every soldier sensed their presence, the rhythmic crunch of boots in the snow, the low murmur of commands, the shifting of rifles. The encirclement wasn't abstract anymore. It was a physical pressure tightening around their bodies. "Go," an officer murmured. No speech, no rallying cry. Just a simple instruction given with the resignation of a man who understood the cost. The soldiers broke from the tree-line and ran. The snow was deeper than it appeared. Each step punched through a crust of ice into powder beneath, slowing them immediately. Their legs churned through it, heavy and uneven. Their breath tore at their lungs, burning in the frozen air. Some men stumbled. Some crawled a few steps before standing again. Their weapons bounced awkwardly against their sides, now more burdens than tools. The Soviets opened fire. Rifle shots cracked along the flank. Bullets snapped past, kicked up bursts of white that drifted down softly even as more gunfire tore across the field. Mortars landed behind them, each explosion muffled by the snow yet powerful enough to knock men off their feet. The soldiers moved as if pulled by invisible threads, stumbling through the cold haze, driven by nothing but instinct. A few fell early, collapsing silently, bodies folding into the snow as though swallowed by it. Others kept moving with shattered determination, refusing to look back. A shout rose from the ridge ahead, though the wind shredded the words before they reached the runners. Still, the sound gave them direction, urgency, hope. The ridge grew closer. Dark shapes appeared at the top, friendly silhouettes or enemies. The soldiers didn't know. They only knew they had to reach it. They forced their legs to move faster, ignoring the pain, the freezing air tearing at their throats, the fear pounding in their chest. They were no longer running toward safety. When only silence crosses the snow. The ridge loomed closer with every brutal, gasping step, but each meter felt heavier than the last. The snowfield was an ocean of white dragging at their legs, pulling them down with every stride. Behind them, Soviet rifles continued their steady work, measured shots, deliberate and calm, picking off men who slowed even slightly. One soldier collapsed forward into the snow. He pushed himself up once, then again, hands slipping on the icy crust. A flare rose into the sky, bathing everything in pale green. In that brief illumination, his hands looked ghostly, almost transparent. He made it a few more steps before his legs gave out completely. No one could stop to lift him. Even compassion had a cost the men could no longer afford. Another private dropped his rifle without realizing it. He stared at his empty hands in confusion, as if they belonged to someone else. Then he turned toward the ridge and walked, not ran, walked, moving in a slow, dreamlike trance toward the promise of shelter. A bullet found him moments later, spinning him sideways into the snow. His body rolled slightly, then lay still. The ridge was close now. German machine guns opened up from the top, firing over the heads of the retreating men, trying to carve a thin curtain of protection. Snow jumped in violent spurts as the tracers cut through the air. One soldier dropped to his knees, gasping, his vision narrowing into a small tunnel. He forced himself forward on hands and knees, clawing at the snow, dragging himself toward the ridge. Another stumbled past him, leaning so far forward he looked as though he might fall with every step. A third man reached the base of the ridge and simply collapsed, unable to lift himself. Hands reached down from above. Arms pulled the men upward. The survivors were hauled onto the ridge, collapsing into heaps, panting, trembling. Their faces were gray from cold and exhaustion. Their eyes were hollow, reflecting nothing but the lingering shock of being alive. When they finally turned back, the view below froze them in place. The snowfield was dotted with the dark shapes of fallen comrades, scattered across the white like forgotten coat buttons. Snow drifted softly over them, beginning the quiet work of erasure. The Soviet advance continued steadily, silhouettes moving with unhurried confidence. The breakout had succeeded, but at a cost so heavy the survivors would never speak of it. Not because they forgot, but because the memory lived too sharply inside them. On the Eastern Front, silence crossed the snow faster than men did, and it buried what the living could not carry. When the war turns into waiting. After the breakout, there was no sense of victory, no exhilaration, no burst of relief. The men simply collapsed behind the ridge, breathing hard, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Survival didn't feel triumphant. It felt hollow, like a drum beaten too many times. The ridge offered height, not safety. It wasn't a fortress or a stronghold. It was just a line of bare earth where men could at least see what approached. They huddled against splintered trees, letting the numbness settle into their bones. Some stared at the sky, others at their boots. A few simply closed their eyes and listened to their own breathing, trying to convince themselves they were still alive. Waiting settled in quickly. Not the gentle kind, the heavy, suffocating waiting that stretches minutes into hours. The front wasn't moving forward anymore. It wasn't even holding. It was pausing, a single breath caught between battles. In that breath, every fear became sharper. Officers whispered among themselves, glancing at maps that had become more hopeful than accurate. Their voices were low and tight, carrying a worry they didn't dare show fully. And the men didn't need explanations. They could see the truth in every gesture. The Soviets were still moving. Winter was deepening. Supplies were fading. The ridge had become a stopgap, not a sanctuary. The men felt it in their bodies. A soldier rubbed his temples, trying to push away memories of running across the snowfield. Another sat with hands pressed to a frostbitten cheek. A third dug his fingers into the frozen earth, as though grounding himself was the only thing keeping panic from rising. Small fires crackled where they could be lit, their flames weak against the wind. The cold crawled beneath coats and up sleeves, ignoring every attempt at warmth. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, each one landing softly before melting and freezing again. Someone whispered, "If we stay here, the cold will do what the Russians couldn't." Another answered, "If we move, they'll finish the job." Neither man spoke loudly. Neither needed to. Waiting became the only thing left to do. Waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for the next attack, waiting for anything that might shift their fate. Nothing came. Sometimes war rages with fire and thunder. Sometimes it grinds down with silence. That day, silence won. When the front becomes a memory of itself. By nightfall, the ridge felt like a place suspended in time, a point where the war paused just long enough for the men to understand how much of themselves they had already lost. They weren't part of a grand advance anymore. They weren't even a full company. They were remnants, scattered pieces of what had once been an army. Darkness fell quickly, swallowing the last of the daylight and turning the ridge into a silhouette against the snow. Fires flickered weakly. Shadows stretched long across the ground. Conversations faded. Men stared into the flickering light, seeing not the flames but memories of roads, forests, and villages left far behind. They talked about home in quiet fragments, a mother making soup, a wife waiting by a window, the feel of a warm stove, the sound of rain on a roof. But each memory felt like something from another lifetime, a life they could barely claim as their own now. War had rewritten the world so thoroughly that even familiar thoughts felt foreign. A soldier touched the corner of a photograph hidden in his pocket, but didn't take it out. He didn't need to see it. He just needed to feel the outline. Another adjusted his boots for the 10th time, though it changed nothing. A third man rubbed his hands together, staring at them as if trying to remember when they had last felt warm. Officers moved among them, checking positions, exchanging quiet words, giving out instructions that carried more hope than real direction. Their faces were drawn tight, marked by the same frostbite and fatigue as the men they commanded. They weren't hiding the truth. They simply had no language that could soften it. Beyond the ridge, the Soviets made themselves known without attacking. Voices drifted through the dark. The rumble of tanks echoed faintly. Equipment clattered. Occasionally a flare rose, revealing a glimpse of the world closing in around them. Endless snow, dark tree leans, silhouettes shifting like ghosts. One soldier muttered, "Feels like the world forgot itself out here." An older one replied, "No, it remembers too much." In that moment, the men understood something quietly devastating. The front was no longer a place on a map. It was a memory they were watching collapse in real time, a shape of trenches, positions, and orders dissolving into snow. The ridge wasn't a defensive line. It was simply where the war had paused long enough for them to feel the weight of what would come next. When capture stops the body but not the fear. Capture on the Eastern Front didn't happen the way the soldiers had imagined it back home. There were no dramatic last stands, no shouted surrender with hands raised high. It happened quietly. A man who had fallen behind during a march. Another who stopped to rest for just a moment too long. A third who collapsed from cold or hunger and couldn't rise fast enough. The war simply caught them. Sometimes Soviet scouts emerged from the trees without warning, their coats blending into the winter landscape. Their rifles were steady, their breath forming thin white plumes that disappeared almost instantly. They approached cautiously, gesturing with small, sharp motions. Other times, capture came in darkness, a boot pressed lightly on a shoulder, a gloved hand signaling for silence, a voice in Russian that meant only one thing: get up. And men did, not out of defiance or obedience, but because there was nothing else to do. The first sensation was disbelief. Even with rifles pointed at them, many felt as though they should be marching still. Their legs twitched with a leftover impulse to move, to run, to continue following a retreat that no longer existed. Then fear seeped in, slow, patient, cold. Fear of the stories whispered around campfires. Fear of camps somewhere far to the east. Fear of never being accounted for, of disappearing into the snow without a name or grave. Fear of the unknown more than anything else. The Soviets confiscated watches, knives, and sometimes even boots. Letters were taken too, the ones soldiers kept folded in pockets for comfort. A few guards wore expressions unreadable in the dim winter light. Others stared with a mixture of exhaustion and hardened distrust. The prisoners moved when ordered, hands raised or clasped behind their heads, the cold stinging their faces. As they formed into small groups and were led away, a realization settled deep inside them. They had survived the breakout, the cold, the hunger, the fear, only to face a new uncertainty. A path without a map. A journey without direction. Capture did not end the fear. It simply changed its shape. The road that no one mapped. The march into captivity had no markers, no names, no clear destination. The prisoners walked in a narrow column across snowfields that seemed to stretch forever, their footsteps muffled by the cold. They moved not in formation, but out of necessity, each man tracking the back of the one ahead, as if the path were held together by nothing but shared exhaustion. Soviet guards paced along the edges of the column. Some watched closely, rifles ready. Others simply walked, as tired as the men they escorted. Their boots crunched in rhythm, a steady metronome that echoed through the cold air. The prisoners learned the unspoken rules quickly. Keep moving, stay in line, do not fall. When a man stumbled, he felt eyes on him immediately. Sometimes a guard paused, waiting to see if he would rise on his own. Sometimes a firm kick nudged him forward. If he stood, the march continued. If he didn't, the line moved on without him. The snow covered those moments quickly, and the march left no time for mourning. The landscape changed with agonizing slowness. Burned-out houses, empty wells, frozen fields dotted with abandoned equipment. Now and then, villagers appeared at a distance, watching in silence. Their faces revealed nothing, not hatred, not sympathy, just a tired awareness of a war that had dragged across their land for too long. At night, the prisoners were herded into barns, ruined farmhouses, or shallow pits dug into the snow. They huddled for warmth, sharing thin scraps of food taken from their pockets or given grudgingly by the guards. Sleep was shallow and full of shivering. The cold claimed more men during those nights than any rifle ever had. As the days passed, hunger blurred thought. Steps became automatic. Words became rare. Some prisoners tried to count their paces, believing that if they reached a certain number, they might arrive somewhere safer. Others recited names beneath their breath, their children, wives, siblings, as if speaking them could keep those memories alive a little longer. But the road stretched on with no sign of its end. The column drifted west to east, carried by forces they could no longer see and could barely understand. The front was far behind them now, swallowed by the winter. Ahead lay a direction no one could name. It wasn't a march anymore. It was surrender to a road that belonged to someone else. The words that never found their way home. Long before the front collapsed around them, the soldiers wrote letters with a kind of quiet urgency, as if each sentence were a thread tying them to a world that felt increasingly distant. They wrote in trenches lit by dying candles, in barns that smelled of smoke and damp straw, on the edges of frozen fields where their breath turned into small, trembling clouds. The ink often froze. Their fingers were too numb to guide the pen. Still, they wrote. The tone of these letters was always brighter than the truth. I'm fine. We're holding strong. Winter is tough, but we're tougher. These were not lies meant to deceive. They were gifts, small comforts sent across impossible distances to people waiting by windows, kitchens, and radios. The men believed that if their families felt reassured, they could endure anything. But as the front shifted and the cold deepened, the letters began to disappear. They were collected at field posts, sorted into bags, tied with string, and never arrived. Some were lost in retreats. Others burned in attacks on depots. Some vanished during chaotic repositioning, and many simply stayed where they were dropped, abandoned on roads buried by snow. The soldiers noticed the silence first. Replies came late, then never. A man would reach into his pocket for a letter he planned to send and find it still there, creased and damp, untouched by the postal system that no longer functioned. The realization was slow and heavy. Nothing they wrote was reaching home anymore. But they kept writing. Some folded the letters into their coat pockets for warmth. Others tucked them into boots or helmets. They wrote about the cold, about numb fingers, about days without food, about the way the sky looked before a bombardment. They wrote about fear, not in the direct, blunt way of confession, but in small phrases that carried the weight of dread. One soldier wrote, "The winter here feels like a wall. I can't see what's beyond it." He sealed the letter carefully. It never left his coat. The words they wrote were meant for mothers, wives, children, brothers, fragile bridges across a continent at war. But the front consumed those bridges, and the men who penned those words carried the weight of what might never be read. On the Eastern Front, even words froze before they reached their destination. The silence that replaced their voices. Back in Germany, families waited for the letters with a patience that frayed slowly. At first they blamed the weather, then the chaos of repositioning, then the railways. They offered themselves explanations that soothed the worry for a week, then a month, until the silence grew too large to ignore. A wife read the same letter every night until the paper softened in her hands. A mother visited the post office, asking if anything had arrived, even a scrap, even a postcard. Children traced stamps with their fingertips, asking when the next message would come. Some homes left a chair empty at the table, a quiet form of hope, as though the missing man might walk through the door at any moment. When letters did arrive, they were often months late, blurred by moisture, the ink feathered into soft shapes. A message written in deep winter might arrive in spring, carrying words that no longer matched the season. "The cold is beginning," or "We'll push forward soon," or "Tell the little one I'm fine." And sometimes the heart of the message, the part unsaid, hurt more than the words. But most letters never came at all. The silence that replaced them became a presence in every home touched by the Eastern Front. A mother folded laundry in quiet. A wife paused mid-sentence, unsure what she had been about to say. Families gathered around radios, hoping for mentions of units, battles, anything that might give shape to uncertainty. They rarely heard what they needed. In the East, the soldiers felt the silence too. No letters from home. No familiar handwriting. No encouragement tucked into envelopes. No reminder that someone, somewhere, still knew their name. The absence tightened something inside them. Their voices grew quieter, their thoughts heavier. Some men stopped writing altogether, convinced the words would be lost. Others wrote more, desperate lines scribbled by candlelight, folded carefully, carried in pockets close to their hearts. They weren't writing for delivery anymore. They were writing to remember who they were. One sergeant slipped a final letter into his boot. "If someone finds me," he said softly, "maybe this will find its way home. But winter does not carry messages. The snow keeps its secrets." And across the front, silence became the language of men who had lost their voices to distance, cold, and war. When home no longer feels like home. For the few who returned from the Eastern Front, coming home felt less like crossing a finish line and more like stepping into a world that had moved on without them. They arrived wearing uniforms that hung awkwardly from bodies thinned by hunger and cold. Their boots were worn, their faces sharpened, their eyes holding the distant look of men who had spent too long staring at horizons that never changed. Home was warm. That was the first shock. The heat of a kitchen, the glow of a stove, the softness of a bed, all of it felt almost unreal. After months of cold that seeped into bone, warmth felt intrusive, overwhelming. A wife reached to touch her husband's cheek, and he flinched without meaning to. A mother embraced her son and felt ribs sharper than she remembered. A child stared uncertainly, trying to match the stranger in front of them with the face from a photograph. The returning men tried to smile. They tried to fit into conversations, into chairs, into the familiar rooms they had once taken for granted. But something inside them stayed out of place. Rooms felt small after the endlessness of the East. The sound of voices felt loud, too quick, too bright. Even comfort became strange, a softness they no longer knew how to accept. At night, many found themselves lying awake in beds that were too warm, too still. Their bodies didn't trust stillness. Silence without danger felt wrong. Some woke gasping, disoriented, reaching for rifles that were no longer beside them. Others slipped quietly out of bed to stand by windows, staring out into the dark, searching for something they couldn't name. Families tried to help. They told stories, cooked meals, filled the air with gentle reminders of normal life. But the men had spent too long surviving on instinct, too long carrying fear in their chests, too long shrinking their lives into the space between footsteps and cold breaths. Those habits didn't vanish with a warm room. One man stood in his childhood kitchen, holding a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. He stared at it as if it were a relic from another world. "It feels wrong to have this much," he whispered. His mother touched his arm, and he flinched again, overwhelmed by a kindness his body no longer remembered how to receive. Another stepped outside into a snowfall that looked softer, gentler, harmless, yet it still sent a shiver through him, echoing memories he couldn't speak aloud. They understood something their families did not. They had returned, but not entirely. Parts of them were still out there, in the forests, in the trenches, on the snowfields. Pieces scattered across a land that had swallowed so many others whole. Home had stayed the same. They had not. And as the days passed, that truth settled deeper inside them. They weren't living their old lives again. They were learning how to exist in new ones, carrying shadows that followed them through every warm room and quiet night. When the war follows you indoors. In the weeks after their return, the soldiers tried to move through the routines of home as if they could weave themselves back into the fabric of their old lives. They greeted neighbors, repaired fences, helped with chores, sat at family tables. But the war followed them indoors, slipping into the quiet spaces between moments. It lived in the way they paused before answering a simple question, weighing the words more slowly than before. It lived in the way they stared at a full plate of food with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. It lived in the way they flinched at sudden noises, a door slamming, a pot clattering, a dog barking unexpectedly. At night, the war reclaimed them. Dreams pulled them back to the snowfields, to forests whispering with hidden movement, to the thundering echo of artillery rolling across frozen ground. Some men woke drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. Others woke cold, sitting upright before they realized the room was warm. A few slipped from their beds to sleep on the floor, unable to explain the gesture except to say the softness of a mattress felt unsafe. Families watched and tried to understand. A wife placed a warm blanket over her husband, only to find him pushing it away minutes later. A mother reached out to her son during a meal, and he tensed before forcing a smile. A child hugged a father's leg, and the man froze, not out of fear, but out of the shock of feeling something gentle after so much brutality. Some returning soldiers found solace in work, chopping wood with mechanical focus, repairing tools, sweeping yards, cleaning stables. The repetition steadied them. Tasks with clear beginnings and endings offered a sense of control they had lost in the chaos of the retreat. Others walked miles each day, through forests, across fields, along rivers, as if motion itself was the only way to quiet their minds. They didn't always know where they were going. They just knew they couldn't stay still. A few tried to talk about what had happened, the cold, the hunger, the nights where footsteps in snow meant death. But the words felt too heavy for the room. The listeners grew pale. The men grew quiet. Some stories were too sharp, too raw, too impossible to share without reopening wounds no one could see. So the soldiers carried them in silence. Over time, the war's presence softened, but it never left completely. A man chopping would pause mid-swing, staring into the distance. Another would stop mid-conversation, his mind drifting somewhere miles away. A third would feel the winter wind on his face and shiver, even in spring. They had survived the Eastern Front. But survival had its own weight. And even in the warmth of home, even surrounded by the people they loved, the war lingered, in memory, in reflex, in the quiet moments when their minds drifted back to a land of snow, silence, and shadows. The front did not remain in the east. It followed them back. The deepest winter. Winter did not peak on the Eastern Front in a single night. It deepened gradually, day after day, tightening its grip until the men stopped wondering how cold it might get and began wondering how much colder they could endure. The season seemed endless, a stretch of time with no beginning and no promise of an end, only the steady descent into temperatures that felt like another form of warfare. The soldiers woke each morning with their coats stiff from frost, their blankets frozen into rigid shapes. Breath rose in sharp, silver plumes that vanished too quickly. Even the air felt solid, as though it needed to be broken with each inhale. The simplest movements became painful. Fingers refused to bend. Knees cracked. Lips split. Eyes watered constantly, and the tears froze on their cheeks. Weapons suffered too. Rifle bolts froze shut. Machine guns jammed after only a few bursts. Lubricants thickened, turning metal sluggish and unpredictable. A man could fire one shot and then spend 5 minutes trying to unfreeze his weapon, hands trembling, breath clouding the steel. Some soldiers slept with their rifles pressed under their coats, their own body heat the only defense against the cold. Horses fared even worse. Many collapsed during marches, legs shaking violently before they fell into the snow. When they could no longer stand, men removed the harnesses and moved on, leaving the animals behind in a silence broken only by their slow, labored breathing. Their bodies froze quickly, stiffening into shapes that dotted the roads like frozen statues of exhaustion. The nights were the hardest. Darkness came early, swallowing the landscape. Fires were dangerous, visible for kilometers, so the men huddled in shallow pits or behind shattered walls, wrapped in thin blankets, teeth clattering uncontrollably. Sleep came in short, shallow waves. A man might doze for 5 minutes before waking again, arms numb, feet burning with frostbite, the cold gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. In those moments, thoughts wandered to strange places. Men dreamed of warmth so vividly they reached for it upon waking, only to find their hands sinking into snow. Others whispered quietly to themselves or recited old prayers, not out of devotion but out of desperation for something familiar. The cold did not simply threaten their bodies. It eroded their sense of time. Days blended together. Dawn and dusk looked nearly identical. A week could pass without distinguishing itself from the next. Some soldiers began speaking of winter as if it were a living thing, not a season, but a force that stalked the front with patient malice. One soldier murmured, "The cold isn't trying to kill us. It's trying to wear us down." And the others, shivering in a half-circle of exhausted silence, knew exactly what he meant. Winter didn't break them all at once. It stripped them down slowly, breath by breath, night by night. When cold becomes the enemy with no face. As winter deepened, the soldiers began to understand something quietly terrifying. The cold wasn't just a condition of the front. It had become the front. It dictated movement, strategy, morale. It crept into joints and thoughts alike. The Soviets were relentless, yes, but winter itself felt invincible. Frostbite arrived like a thief. First the fingertips numbed, then the toes. Then small white patches appeared on skin, spreading like pale stains across cheeks, ears, and hands. A man might rub his fingers until they stung, then burned, then suddenly stopped feeling anything at all. That was when panic set in. Not loud panic, but a silent, inward dread, the realization that a part of his body was slipping away from him. Medics did what they could. They wrapped limbs in cloth, handed out tiny portions of ointment, offered quiet reassurance. But there was only so much to give. Frostbite didn't care about ranks or experience. A veteran froze as quickly as a recruit. A seasoned officer could lose a toe as easily as a boy barely trained for war. Clothing became both armor and burden. Coats stiffened into inflexible shells. Scarves iced over within minutes, turning stiff against lips and chins. Boots froze solid during the night, requiring long minutes of painful stomping in the morning to soften enough for walking. Some soldiers lined their socks with newspaper or straw, anything to add a layer between their skin and the winter's bite. Marches became slower, more painful. Every step sent needles of cold through their bodies. Breath rasped sharply, freezing in their mustaches and forming brittle ice along the edges of their collars. Men walked hunched over, hands pressed beneath their armpits, shoulders trembling. And then there was the wind, the real terror. It could rise without warning, sweeping across the plains in long, chilling gusts that roared like distant engines. It found every gap in every coat, slipping beneath layers, freezing sweat instantly into thin sheets of ice. The wind didn't push or pull. It carved, slicing through cloth and skin until the men felt flayed by air itself. Visibility dropped to nothing. Snow swirled in frantic spirals, erasing tracks, blurring the line between earth and sky. Men could march for hours and not recognize the landscape. Trees melted into white walls. The horizon vanished entirely. A soldier might lose sight of the man walking only a few steps ahead, and once he fell out of line, the blizzard swallowed him. Sometimes they found the stragglers later, curled beneath a drift of snow, their bodies frozen in poses that suggested sleep rather than death. Other times, the snow kept them. The Soviets understood the advantage. They attacked when storms rose, when visibility dropped, when the Germans were slowed and weakened. Gunfire cracked through blizzards, echoing off the wind. Shadows appeared in the white haze, quick, coordinated, deadly, before vanishing again. The Germans fired blindly, uncertain whether they hit anything at all. Winter favored those who belonged to it. At night, the soldiers lay curled in the snow, sharing meager warmth. Conversations faded into trembling breaths. Dreams became fragmented. Some whispered about home, imagining fireplaces, warm kitchens, and beds with real sheets. Others stayed awake, afraid that sleep would weaken them enough to never wake again. One soldier murmured into the darkness, "I don't fear the Russians half as much as I fear closing my eyes." The man beside him nodded, teeth chattering too hard to speak. In the deepest winter of the Eastern Front, there were battles fought with rifles, and battles fought with breath. And every morning the men woke, not because they were strong, but because winter had not. The lost companies. There were places along the Eastern Front where men disappeared without a sound, not in battles marked by explosions or sweeping maneuvers, but in quiet stretches of forest and snow where visibility shrank and the world closed in around them. These weren't dramatic last stands. They were erasures, entire squads, sometimes full companies, swallowed by winter and distance. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew the signs. A patrol that didn't return. A column that marched into a patch of forest and never came out. Bootprints leading east, ending abruptly in wind-swept snow. Sometimes the only trace was a forgotten helmet half buried in ice, or a scarf snagged on a branch, fluttering in the wind like a signal no one was left to interpret. The lost companies became a kind of whispered legend among the troops. Not the kind that reassured. The kind that haunted them during the long, freezing nights. Men lowered their voices when referencing them, as if speaking too loudly might attract the same fate. One company, they said, had marched north after receiving an outdated order. They were spotted by villagers 2 days later, trudging single file through a field, weapons slung low. After that, nothing. No bodies. No equipment. No trace. The Soviets claimed nothing. The snow kept its silence. Another group vanished during a retreat. They had been seen entering a dense birch forest to avoid a Soviet patrol. The forest was searched days later. The only thing found was a broken rifle butt and a circle of disturbed snow, the kind that suggested a struggle, but nothing more. Some believed they had been captured. Others insisted they had succumbed to the cold. A few whispered that the men had turned on themselves in desperation. None of these explanations brought comfort. There were stranger accounts too. Stories of soldiers following tracks that led in circles because snowstorms had erased their orientation. Men marching for hours only to find themselves back at the same frozen creek. Groups splitting unintentionally when visibility collapsed to a few meters. The front wasn't just lines on a map. It was a shifting, unpredictable landscape that could swallow direction itself. The fear of becoming one of the lost seeped into the soldiers' movements. They stayed closer together, counted heads more frequently, marked trees with scratches to retrace their steps. Yet the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, all of it worked against vigilance. One night, during a blizzard, a soldier woke and realized the man who had been lying next to him was gone. He thought he had wandered off to relieve himself. But when dawn came, only smooth snow lay where the footprints should have been. No one knew what had happened. No one spoke of it again. The Eastern Front had room for millions of men, but it also had room to hide thousands of them. In forests, ravines, frozen rivers, abandoned buildings, collapsed trenches. The land was too vast, the winter too deep, the chaos too complete. Some were found months later when the thaw came. Others never surfaced at all. The front moved on. The snow remained. And the memory of the lost companies lingered like a quiet shadow across every new position. When absence becomes a story of its own. As winter dragged on, the stories of the lost companies didn't fade. They multiplied. Absence on the Eastern Front was not an anomaly. It was a companion to every march, every patrol, every moment a soldier stepped beyond the warmth of a shared fire. Men didn't just fear the enemy. They feared vanishing without witness. Sometimes the signs were small. A set of footprints diverging from the main trail, leading into a grove of trees. Footprints that simply stopped after 20 meters. The men assigned to investigate found nothing but a glove lying in the snow, stiff and curled as if it had tried to hold on to something in the final moment. Other times the signs were unmistakable. A camp abandoned in haste, blankets scattered, embers still faintly warm, tin cups overturned. No blood, no bodies, no tracks leading away. Only the suggestion of sudden flight, or sudden capture. What unnerved the soldiers most was how quietly it happened. Battles were loud. Skirmishes echoed in the distance. But disappearance worked in silence, slipping between trees, between snowdrifts, between the hours when men drifted toward sleep. A corporal once said, staring into the darkness of an unlit forest line, "It's not the Russians I'm afraid of. It's the spaces between us." His words stayed with the men far longer than any briefing. There were moments when the soldiers caught glimpses of movement in the distance, shadows slipping between trees, too quick and soundless to identify. Sometimes the Soviets, sometimes animals, sometimes tricks of exhaustion. Each possibility was no less unnerving than the others. The Germans adapted in small ways. They tied lengths of rope between trees to trace their steps in blizzards. They assigned pairs during night duties so no one stood alone in the dark. They carved quick notches into bark while scouting, leaving a zigzag pattern that promised, at minimum, a breadcrumb trail back to camp. But even these precautions failed when the weather turned violent, when snow fell thick as smoke and wind erased every trace of movement in minutes. One night, during a violent storm, a group of 7 soldiers went to gather firewood. Only 3 returned. They were pale, trembling, unable to explain what had happened. They claimed they had been walking in a straight line the entire time. Yet they returned from the opposite direction, their own boot prints already buried by the storm. As the weeks passed, the lost companies took on a meaning beyond tactical fear. They became reminders of how thin the line truly was between survival and disappearance. The front consumed men in many ways, through hunger, frostbite, bullets, and exhaustion, but the quiet vanishing carried a unique terror. It suggested that a man could slip from the world without struggle, without witness, without even understanding when the moment had come. For every soldier who survived, the thought lingered. Will anyone know if I don't come back? Will my absence even be noticed? The front didn't answer such questions. It simply kept moving, leaving behind patches of disturbed snow and empty air where men had once stood. Absence became its own kind of story, the kind told in whispers, with eyes lowered and hands trembling near the fire. After the march. Surviving the march should have felt like deliverance. The soldiers who made it through the breakout, the cold, and the endless retreat expected that once the danger passed, their bodies would rest and their minds would quiet. But survival came with its own weight, a different kind of heaviness that settled inside them like a second winter. In the days after the retreat, when they were finally allowed a moment to breathe, the men discovered that rest did not bring relief. Their legs trembled even when they sat still. Their hands remained half-curled, as if still gripping rifles. Their shoulders stayed tense, refusing to unclench. They ate greedily, unable to trust that food would be there the next day, and drank water as though it might vanish between gulps. Sleep was shallow and restless. Eyes snapped open at the slightest sound, a shifting log, a cough, the wind brushing against a torn wall. Some couldn't sleep lying down. Their bodies had grown so used to collapsing against trees or snowbanks that a bed, even a crude one, felt like a trap. Others slept in short bursts, waking suddenly with the memory of running across the snowfield still pounding in their chest. Their thoughts drifted constantly. One moment they were present, whispering with comrades or staring into a small fire. The next, they were miles away, reliving the rhythm of boots over ice, the sound of bullets tearing through branches, the dull roar of mortars chasing them through the white expanse. Most kept their fears quiet, not because they lacked words, but because they feared speaking would make those memories too solid, too real. They had survived, and yet part of them remained out there, in the frozen places where their bodies had moved on instinct and hope alone. Some withdrew completely. They sat with their backs against ruined walls, eyes fixed on their boots or on some distant point beyond the horizon. They answered questions slowly, if at all. They blinked as though waking from a dream that had followed them into daylight. Others became restless, unable to stay still for long. They paced the perimeter of their camp, checking the same paths again and again, searching for threats no one else could see. They were not expecting an attack. They were expecting something. They didn't know what. They just felt that danger never truly left. A few tried to talk about what they had seen, the bodies in the snow, the men collapsing mid-step, the comrades who had vanished into storms without a sound. But the words felt too heavy. Their voices cracked, and whatever they managed to say barely scratched the surface of what they carried. One soldier whispered, "I keep thinking I left a piece of myself out there." Another replied, after a long pause, "Maybe we all did." The truth settled quietly inside them. Survival was not an ending. It was a beginning of something harder, a reckoning with what they had endured and what they had lost, not to bullets or hunger, but to fear, cold, and the slow unraveling of the self. The march was over, but its echo followed them with every breath. When survival becomes its own burden. In the days and weeks after the march ended, the soldiers began to understand that survival carried its own weight, not the frantic urgency of battle or the immediate terror of retreat, but a slower, quieter heaviness that settled into the spaces where adrenaline used to live. Their bodies healed, but not evenly. Frostbite eased, yet left fingertips numb. Wounds scabbed and tightened. Muscles regained strength, but they trembled without warning, a memory of exhaustion lodged deep in the fibers. The cold had left marks that no amount of fire could erase. But the mind healed differently. Some men grew fearful of stillness. The absence of danger felt suspicious, unnatural. They struggled to sit by a fire without glancing over their shoulders every few seconds. Nights were the worst. Each creak of wood, each gust of wind, each shifting shadow dragged them back to the snowfields, back to the sense that something unseen was always approaching. Others withdrew into themselves. They spoke less, moved less, reacted slower. Their comrades sometimes joked that these men were still on the march, but there was no laughter in it. The hollow gaze in their eyes told the truth. They were trapped in the memory of running, their minds replaying the breakout over and over, as though searching for a different outcome that would never exist. A few became restless and unpredictable. Their bodies twitched at sudden noises. Their temper flared at small inconveniences. Even simple tasks, tying a knot, lighting a fire, tightening a belt, could unravel them without warning. They weren't angry at others. They were angry at the echo of helplessness they had felt in the snow. And then there were the quiet ones, the men who seemed outwardly fine, who smiled, nodded, obeyed orders, performed their duties. But their calmness was thin, stretched over something fragile. They startled too easily. They stared into the distance too long. They blinked a second too late when spoken to. These were the men carrying the heaviest memories, and they bore them in silence, as though afraid that sharing them might make the memories permanent. Some soldiers tried to journal, scribbling in small notebooks with hands that shook from habit rather than cold. They wrote about the march, the cold, the fear, the comrades lost. But after a few pages, many stopped. The words felt inadequate, too small for what they had lived through. A lieutenant once said while staring into the embers of a dying fire, "We left men behind, but we also left parts of ourselves." No one answered. They didn't need to. Every man around that fire felt a missing piece inside him, not a wound, but a hollow, like a space where something essential had once lived. Some coped by helping others, sharing food, adjusting blankets, checking on comrades who hadn't spoken in days. Small kindnesses became a way to anchor themselves, to rebuild something human inside their fractured minds. Others wandered alone at dawn, walking aimlessly through half-frozen fields, breathing the cold air as if trying to find proof they were still alive. They didn't search for danger. They searched for themselves. In time, the front moved again. Orders came. New positions were taken. The war pulled them forward, carrying them into battles where exhaustion and memory intertwined. But the march stayed with them. Every step forward felt connected to the steps they had taken across the snowfield, the ones that had decided who lived and who didn't. They had survived, but survival had changed them. Some found resilience in that truth. Others found only weight. And all of them, in quiet moments, felt the echo of winter breathing behind them, as if the front itself walked with them wherever they went. The winter that lives inside them. You begin to notice it long after the war ends, a cold that doesn't belong to the weather. It settles in quiet moments, when the world around you is warm and safe, yet something inside you remembers a different kind of silence. A silence shaped by snowfields, hollow footpaths, and the faint rattle of breath in air too cold to hold sound. For many who returned from the east, winter never came and went. It stayed, not as frost on windows or ice on roads, but as a thin film across memory, a chill that moved differently, inward instead of outward. Sometimes it arrived as a tremor in the hands, other times as a breath caught halfway, as though the lungs expected the sting of frozen air. Even the softest snowfall could bring old instincts rising from somewhere deep, where the body still believed it was being hunted. A sudden gust, the way it pressed against the eardrum, could feel like distant artillery. The crunch of snow beneath boots on a quiet night could echo the marches that once stretched endlessly across plains where the sky felt too large and the ground too unforgiving. It wasn't dramatic, this inner winter. It didn't announce itself with fear or panic. It moved with the same slow persistence as real cold, creeping, settling, tightening. An old soldier could be warming his hands by a fire and still feel the bite of wind from decades earlier, as though the past had never quite released its hold. Families sensed it even when they didn't understand it. They saw it in the way a father paused before opening the door on a snowy morning. They noticed how he hesitated before walking across a frosted field, how his eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in a careful, measured awareness, the habit of someone who once survived by listening to what winter tried to hide. Some men learned to live with it quietly. They worked, laughed, raised children, all while carrying an interior landscape that no season could soften. Others found the weight heavier, their nights longer, their sleep thin. A sudden cold draft through the room could pull them back through years, back to a place where breath felt like brittle glass and footsteps felt too loud. But in all of them, winter remained. Not as a memory of suffering, but as a companion, a shadow stitched into the fabric of who they had become. There were moments, brief, delicate, when the inner winter softened, watching a child build a small snowman, hearing laughter echo across a field blanketed in white, feeling the first warm breeze of early spring. But even in these gentle interruptions, the cold lingered beneath the surface, quiet and patient. Aging veterans often spoke less as time went on, not because they had nothing to say, but because winter had taught them the value of silence. The Eastern Front carved a certain stillness into them, a slow, contemplative way of moving through the world. Every decision measured, every step deliberate, every breath taken as though weighing the space between danger and calm. Some found comfort in rituals that no one else understood, sweeping snow from a doorstep in long, smooth strokes, warming their hands before touching cold metal, checking the wind before walking outdoors. Little acts that once meant survival, now woven into the rhythm of peacetime life. And on certain nights, when the air grew sharp and moonlight glinted on frost, they would lie awake feeling that familiar presence, the winter that followed them home. It wasn't frightening anymore. It had become part of them, like an echo from a story they no longer told, but could never forget. They learned to carry it with quiet dignity, to let the world warm around them even if their own warmth flickered at times, to let their loved ones believe that age, not memory, made them slow on cold mornings. But inside, where no one could see, the snow still fell gently. The sky still stretched wide over empty plains. The wind still whispered through broken trees. And the winter that once nearly took their lives became the winter that stayed with them always, a reminder of endurance, of survival, of the strange, fragile strength that grows in places where warmth is a distant thing. In the end, that winter was not an enemy. It was a testament, a quiet record of everything they endured. And though the world around them moved from season to season, the cold inside them remained steady, an old companion walking beside them long after the war had passed into history. Aftermath. You sit with the silence for a moment, not the silence of victory, not the silence of defeat, just the silence that follows men who have walked too far through winter. You weren't there with them, yet somehow you feel the weight of their steps, the slow drag of boots stiff with frost, the hollow ache behind the ribs, the way cold can shape a life, as surely as any uniform or order ever did. The Eastern Front leaves an imprint on you, even from this distance. You sense how the world must have felt to them, the sky too wide, the distances too large, the land itself indifferent. Not cruel, just vast in a way that swallowed everything that tried to cross it. In the quiet, you feel the steady truth rising like breath in cold air. Not every soldier believed in the war they fought. Not every man who marched east understood what he was stepping into. Many arrived as conquerors and left as ghosts trailing behind the retreat, their stories scattered across villages whose names no longer exist on maps. You picture one of them now, not a hero, not a monster, just a tired, freezing man, standing on a ridge he didn't choose to hold. His hands shake. His breath curls in the air. He looks out over the whiteness, trying to see a road home, through a winter that does not forgive. And somewhere inside, you sense the quiet truth he might never say aloud. No one wins against a land that fights with cold. Not a regiment, not an army, not an empire. You let that truth settle. You let the quiet deepen around it, and you understand why so many veterans, on every side of that vast front, spoke of winter more than they spoke of the enemy, because winter was the enemy, and winter never left. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the last echoes of marching feet fade into the snow. Before you drift off, if stories told in whispers are the kind you carry with you, take a soft moment to subscribe. It helps these memories find their way back through the dark. And if you feel like sharing, tell us where you're listening from, or which image stayed with you the longest. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.